Oh, people of YouTube, don't you dare be sour. Clap for good mic work commentaries and feel the power.
What's going on, everyone? Good Mike Work Commentaries back at you. We've got a fun Patreon-sponsored video to do today. This is a fun topic. This is going to be a podcast on WWE and WCW Transitional Champions. This podcast today is brought to you by a great supporter and awesome listener of the channel, Reese Jones, who is sponsored to have a few of these reviews done in the past. This latest request was an interesting one and one that I was excited to tackle because we've had a lot of transitional champions throughout the years, and some are even debatable. We're going to talk about a few here that may or may not even fall into that category. So it should be a fun kind of hangout and discussion. I wouldn't really categorize this as a review, more than a discussion, which is kind of what it is. So it'll be interesting to hear all of your feedback in the comments below. And if you have any names to add to this list as we go through here, some of the more famous transitional champions. There's a very good chance we're not going to cover all of them, but I've written down pretty much by memory anyone that I consider to be a transitional champion. And we'll talk about the circumstances, who they beat, who they lost it to, and everything going on around that time. So this video, of course, will also be available in podcast form. I'll stick a downloadable MP3 up on the website, and you can listen wherever podcasts are found. And before we really dive into this topic here, I just want to say thank you to Reese Jones one more time for sponsoring this discussion. It should be a lot of fun, and I also want to read your initial message so the listeners can get an idea of what it is you're looking to hear in this discussion. So here's what Reese wrote in when he had this idea. Hey, Greg, it's been a while since I did one of these, but I've got an idea for a video and just want to make sure it's a topic you can work with before going ahead. The topic is the need and use of transitional champions, and does it help or hurt the title and superstar? In my 20 years of watching, there have been good and bad examples, but I think you'd be able to look at championships through different periods of time from both WCW and WWE and give a fair and honest opinion. Let me know what you think. Well, Reese, obviously, I thought it was a good idea, and we went ahead and went through with this one here, and I've got a lot of notes and a lot of stuff to get into, and I would also like to apologize for you waiting kind of a while for me to do this. I think it's been a few weeks. So finally getting this done now, and I'm really glad that you suggested this because I don't know if it's a topic we really would have discussed in great detail. We might bring up transitional champions from time to time on the show or on the channel or whatnot, but, you know, in terms of a full video dedicated to that, probably not. So it should be fun. Maybe you guys can add some stuff, teach me a few things, and maybe you'll learn something too. So that's what we're going to get into here and begin this discussion on transitional champions. And to answer one of your early questions that you wrote in your original message in terms of, you know, if a transitional title reign is good or bad. I think any world title run, regardless of if it's transitional or not, is always a good thing for a wrestler or a superstar to add that to your legacy and your resume. And for a lot of talents, sometimes being a transitional champion is all they are. So we might even see some examples of that as we go through here. So I think where we want to start is in WWE, because WWE has a shit ton of them. When I was writing down my notes for WCW, let me scroll down here. I think I only have maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe six good examples of transitional champions in WCW, where in WWE there are a plethora of them. And I think we should start at the very beginning. The very first transitional champion in wrestling history pretty much was Ivan Koloff. Now, Ivan Koloff was a wrestling legend, the Russian Bear. He actually used to live in the same hometown as me. I grew up or spent a portion of my childhood in Greenville, North Carolina, and Ivan lived there for years. Everybody knew him. They saw him around. He was very active in the community and the churches and all that stuff, and everybody just knew Ivan. He just walked around like a local yokel down in eastern North Kakalaki. So Ivan was the man, and he has a lot of history attached to him because he was the guy that ended Bruno Sammartino's nearly 8, count them, year-long title reign in WWE after he beat Buddy Rogers. I think in total of days, it was somewhere around 2,800 days that Bruno held the title for. And he was going to be going away for a little bit, and they needed to transition away from him. But they had plans to put the title on a babyface, Pedro Morales. Well, whoever is going to beat Bruno Sammartino after 8 years in Madison Square Garden, which is his home, there is nobody in wrestling history to this day, I still don't think, that is more over. That includes Hogan and includes Austin, that was more over than Bruno in the Garden in the 60s. There was no touching it. And there was no glass shattering. There was no real American. There was no posing. It was just this big, bulky, hairy Italian guy coming out to no music, simply being announced by the ring announcer, completely bare, raw, just as bare bones as it gets. And he was blowing the roof off of the Garden for years and years and years. So whoever was going to beat Bruno, it could start a riot. And you really need a heel to do that, because if you want to run with Pedro for a few years, which is what they did, Pedro can't be the guy to beat Bruno Sammartino. So in January of 1971, they had Ivan Koloff beat Bruno Sammartino. There's only one video of it that exists, and it is bizarre and eerie. I mean, this is 6 years before I was born, and to hear that just stunned, deafening silence in Madison Square Garden, like a pin drop, back then, when it was just packed and people were so energetic and so enthusiastic. And it was like, it was like the entire arena watched their dog get hit by a car. It was the craziest thing, I'm sure. And to be in the arena that night, I can't even imagine what it must have been like for anybody that lived and breathed that Bruno run and was so invested in it and loved him so much. To see him beat like that, oh my God, I couldn't even imagine. And so Ivan was lucky to get out of that arena in one piece and with his life. And he was the guy that put an end to Bruno's run. And I think it was about 3 weeks. I think his run was 21 days. I think it was like 3 weeks to the day. And he defended the title against Pedro Morales in the Garden. I believe it was also in the Garden. Pedro wins and would go on to hold the title for about 3 years, give or take, something like that. So Ivan was the first guy. I mean, Bruno had that run. I mean, an 8-year-long title run now, I don't even think the fans could emotionally handle a half of that. I mean, Roman Reigns has been champion now for over a year, and people are acting like, oh, this is absurd and shit like that. I'm like, man, you would have hated it in the 60s. So that was a pretty big deal, I think, back then. And so Ivan has got to be at the very top of the list of transitional champions in WWE. Is he the most famous transitional champion in the WWE, in WWE history? I kind of say no. I think the most famous transitional champion in WWE history came just a few years later, came 10 years later, 12 years later, when the Iron Sheik ended Bob Backlund's 5-year, 4-year long title run, whatever it was. He had a title reign very similar to Bruno's, that spanned thousands of days. It was pretty incredible. So Backlund wasn't maybe as over as Bruno was, but Backlund was really carrying the company on his own. And even though there was a couple of hiccups in his title reign with Antonio Inoki and the title being held up and winning it back and all of that, WWE still recognizes this as one uninterrupted title run. So when he stepped into the ring with the Iron Sheik and they did the deal with the camel clutch and Arnold Skolin threw in the towel, that was all because, like we just talked about recently here on the channel in one of our videos, Vern Gagne did not put the title on Hulk Hogan, and there was a little bit of a rift there with money and shit like that, and basically there was a falling out with Vern in the AWA when Hogan was really starting to bubble and really starting to peak. He jumped over to Vince McMahon in December of '83, showed up, I think, to help out Bob Backlund or something like that. On TV, came in as a babyface. Last time he was there, he had Blassie with him, and he was a heel. And he says he's here to do the right thing now and all that shit. And then just a couple of weeks later, the beginning of 1984, January of '84, they put Hogan in the ring with the Iron Sheik in Madison Square Garden. Rest is history. Hogan really couldn't be the guy to come in and beat Backlund. They needed a guy to transition to Hogan, and that's what Sheik was. And I think Sheik is the most famous because Sheik was the guy that put over Hogan. I mean, I remember I was watching wrestling before Hogan was even champion. So when he won and he beat the Sheik and he's got the leg hooked and he's doing that, Sheik was definitely the most famous one because that Hogan's run, more than Bruno's, more than Backlund's, took WWE to levels that it had never seen. And Sheik was right in the center of all of that. So I'm going to kind of vote Iron Sheik on the most famous transitional champion in WWE history, in my humble opinion. Let's fast forward a few years later, 1988 now. I'll set the stage for you. Little 11-year-old Good Mic Work is sitting on his living room floor watching one of those old box TVs that sat on the floor, and it's prime time. Main event, 1988 in February. What night of the week was this? I think it was a Friday night or something like that. It still is the highest rated wrestling show ever watched. I think they did like 33 million people watch this show. It was Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant rematch from WrestleMania 3. And this was the deal where Andre, they did the twin referee with Earl and Dave Hebner. Andre won the title and actually was champion for about 30 seconds until he passed the title over to Ted DiBiase. So in a lot of ways, you could consider DiBiase a transitional champion as well, because they were going to be moving the title from Hulk Hogan to another babyface, Randy Savage. I guess this is a little bit similar to Bruno and Pedro and Backlund and Hogan earlier on. Now it's going to be Hogan and Savage, but they need that middleman. So Andre, and this was the very first night, by the way, of that Winged Eagle title hanging right there on the wall. That's the first time this belt has ever been seen on TV, and three people wore it in the same night: Hogan, Andre, and DiBiase. Very interesting history. So Andre, he's interviewed by Mean Gene, and he gives the title to DiBiase. Of course, Jack Tunney's like, no fucking way. They hold up the title and they do the tournament at WrestleMania 4 that Savage goes on to win. So Andre the Giant, even though his one WWE title run was 30 seconds long, he's a transitional champion. They used him as a way to move the belt from Hogan to Savage. Hogan was going to go do no holds barred, and they really wanted to make Savage. Savage had that whole run, that year-long run until, of course, he ran into the red and yellow at WrestleMania 5 when the Mega Powers exploded. But I don't consider Savage to be a transitional champion. They rode him for that year. Obviously, yes, he was there to pass the belt back to Hogan eventually, but that was a career-defining title run for Savage. So I don't categorize him, at least that particular run anyway, as transitional, although I think he did have runs later on in his career that would be. A couple years after that, let's go Slaughter. We got to go Slaughter. 1991. Warrior beat Hogan, of course, at WrestleMania 6. I really think they could have ran that one back in a rematch at WrestleMania 7 and sold out the LA Coliseum and whatnot and done 100,000 people. But whatever the case was, Warrior started having his issues politically and stuff behind the scenes. Vince was over his ass, and it was time to go back to Hogan. But instead of having the rematch and having Warrior lose to Hogan, they decided to have Sergeant Slaughter come in as the Iraqi sympathizer to match up with what was going on in the Gulf War, and he beat the Ultimate Warrior with help from Savage at the Royal Rumble and won the title in one of the most obvious and predictable storylines WWE has ever done, when they were going to have Slaughter now be champion going into WrestleMania as the evil bad guy from the country we're at war with, and going in to face the big, jacked up American hero in Hulk Hogan and obviously go down. So Slaughter was literally a transitional champion. Even though that was his only run, it was transitional. It was a way to move the belt from Warrior to Hogan. I think we've got to put Ric Flair in this category as well, about a year or so later in late 92. Now, Flair had two runs in the company. One was the first one, of course, at the Royal Rumble when he won, entering at number 3 and one of the best Royal Rumbles in history. I don't really think that run by Flair was transitional, because there was a lot of shit going on then. It looked like Hogan was going to be leaving, and they should have Flair win the title from him to kind of keep the ship afloat until Hogan comes back or whatever the fuck. But they decided to go with Savage instead and not do the Mania match between Hogan and Flair at WrestleMania 8. And there's a lot of just weird shit going on there that in hindsight, I think a lot of us would have done many things differently in that whole situation. But he still won the title at the Royal Rumble to drop it to Savage. But as short as that run was, I don't even really consider that as a transitional run. I think that was WWE making Ric Flair, one of the most famous wrestlers in the world, their champion for a little while. The run that felt more transitional to me with Flair was the one that came later, after SummerSlam, when Savage held the title through SummerSlam, and then they had a rematch, I think, on Superstars. It was a taped show to be aired on TV, which was bizarre. and Ric Flair won the title back from Savage. That match, as a backstory, apparently Vince McMahon was just furious how the match went and made them go out there and redo the whole thing. And it was shortly after that time that Vince decided to pivot and move over to Bret Hart, get away from Savage and Flair, and put the title on Bret. So I think maybe he didn't want Bret to beat Savage or something like that, so having Flair win the belt back so Bret could beat Flair definitely makes Ric Flair's late 1992 run transitional. I only think it lasted a couple of weeks. I'm not even sure the exact date on when that was, but it was pretty quick after Flair won the title that he was dropping it to Bret in Saskatoon. So definitely Flair 92 goes on that list. Yokozuna, in a lot of ways too, that initial run, obviously, at WrestleMania 9, he was transitional champion for about 30 fucking seconds when he beat Bret Hart, and then Hogan came out to challenge Yoko, and they moved the title to Hogan. Yoko was used as the transition between the champion being Bret Hart and the champion being Hulk Hogan. There's no better definition of a transitional champion in history, I don't think, than Yokozuna at WrestleMania 9. But however, he would come back to beat Hogan at the King of the Ring and hold the title for a very long time until he would drop it back to Bret at WrestleMania 10. So Yoko in 93 there definitely was transitional. In 1994, I'd go Bob Backlund for sure as a transitional champion. It was kind of nice to see WWE pass that title back to him after all those years, after 11 years after losing it. Beating Bret for it was nice, but still, he's transitional. Vince has decided he's going to move from Bret to Diesel. But just like those other examples I mentioned earlier, Pedro and Bruno, Hogan and Backlund, Hogan and Savage, and also Hogan and Bret, or Bret and Hogan, you got the same situation here where, Vince wants to make Diesel, but not at the expense of Bret. So you take the belt off of Bret, put it on a heel, and Diesel can beat Backlund in the Garden, and did it in 8 seconds or whatever it was, just kicked him right in the gut, power bombed him, won the title at a fucking house show in 1994, about 3 days after the Survivor Series. Very strange. But Backlund, even though, he was a WWE legend, this particular run that just lasted a couple of days was certainly transitional. Speaking of Bret Hart, I think we got to at least mention Bret. His run when he beat Diesel the next year at Survivor Series in 95, when he beat Diesel for the title, that was awesome. But even as early as Survivor Series, the writing was on the wall. You could tell that it was going to be Bret and Shawn at WrestleMania. And that meant that Bret has said this himself, that he was really just a placeholder. He was just holding the title to pass it to Shawn at WrestleMania, and he really didn't appreciate that. And he went out of his way to make sure that his title run was memorable, and it was. That victory over Diesel was one of my favorite Survivor Series matches ever. The following month, when he faced Davey Boy Smith in Pennsylvania at In Your House, and that was a bloody brawl in Hershey that was fucking great. He had a good match with Taker at the Rumble. He fought Diesel in a cage. Bret was working hard and wrestling hard during that time period, but still, he was definitely a transitional champion, as he was there as just the guy to pass the belt to Bret, or pass the belt to Shawn, excuse me. But Bret, he deserves credit for recognizing that, oh fuck, I'm in the middle of a transitional run here. I'm going to do my best to make sure it's not a transitional run. And I think he did. It was one of my favorite Bret Hart runs, even though it was pretty short. But in the end, transitional. Here's a debatable one. Sid. 1997, of course, Sid, we just did a watch-along on the Survivor Series 1996 last week, where Sid won the title in the main event. That whole situation was meant to be for Vader. And when Vader got booted out because Shawn poo-pooed the whole thing, they inserted Sid instead and did the whole storyline with Sid, which I think worked out just fine. Now, after Shawn had regained the title from Sid at the Royal Rumble, that was when Shawn lost his smile. So Shawn loses his smile. They make that 4-way pay-per-view match that I believe was going to be a number 1 contenders match. Now it's for the title. Bret Hart wins in that match, so I suppose you could even consider Bret's run transitional since he won the title at the Final Four. And the very next night on Raw, with help from Stone Cold Steve Austin, Sid beats Bret Hart for the title, and he's the champion going into WrestleMania 13 to face The Undertaker. So I think maybe Sid's first run, he wasn't transitional. I think it was meant to be that way. Just tell that story of Shawn losing the title and then winning it back in his hometown. But that second run by Sid, when he won on Raw, only to go into WrestleMania, and clearly if he's going into WrestleMania to defend against The Undertaker, that writing was on the wall. Undertaker was definitely going to win at WrestleMania and win the title. Nobody doubted it. So I think that second run by Sid in 97 is definitely a transitional run. Couple of years later, I think 98 was all right. I mean, Kane, you can't even consider Kane in 98 a transitional champion because he wasn't used to transition the championship from anybody else. It was just went from Austin to Austin. He was just used to transition it from one Austin to the other. So he beat Austin, and then Austin just won it back the next night. So I don't even know if that counts as transitional, but the next year with Mick Foley, with Mankind, definitely does. SummerSlam 1999, it's the triple threat, Triple H against Austin and Mankind. Jesse Ventura was the special referee for this thing, and this was back when Austin, I guess at the time, didn't think Triple H was a big enough star to beat him, and he didn't want to lose to him. So they basically did a deal here where Mankind won the title instead, and then Triple H beat him for it the next night on Raw. It was either the next night or the week after, but I'm pretty sure it was the next night. So Foley winning the title is kind of funny that, after all of those years later, what we would see happen in the future with Triple H, how the fans would perceive him as selfish and not wanting to do jobs. He was a victim of it, early on when he was trying to make it, when he was trying to compete with Austin and Rock on the roster. You had Austin holding him down. I don't want to lose to you. That's what Shawn did and shit. So I always just kind of found that funny, and what goes around comes around, I suppose. So Austin wanted nothing to do with Triple H in that affair, so Foley took the title instead, and Triple H beat Foley for it. So Foley 99, without Austin's attitude, he probably wouldn't have even won that title at all. So I think that is definitely transitional. I think the Big Show's got a couple of options here. The first one is in 1999 as well, just a few months later. After all this went down, Austin, of course, gets injured, or he's been injured. He's got to get his neck repaired. So they do the hit and run at Survivor Series in 99. But the problem with that is that he was advertised. Austin was advertised to be in that triple threat match, probably up until that point, one of the biggest triple threats in history. I don't even know if we've ever gotten. We certainly have. Help me out, in the comments below. I'm not even sure if we've gotten Rock, Austin, and Triple H in a three-way ever. I'm sure we have. I just can't think of one off the top of my head. So that was a big disappointment, the fact that match was advertised all the way up until Showtime, only for Austin to be run over and be replaced. So they put the Big Show in as a last-minute replacement for Austin, and they had him win. And I think that the reason most likely is that they gave the title to Big Show is just to give the fans some sort of a surprise. Because if you just put him in the match and then one of the other two guys won, I'm sure the fans would love it if The Rock won, but let's say Triple H won or something like that, it would be like, man, not only did you not give us Austin, but you had a heel win, in the main event. So I think WWE, in order to make up for the fact that they were clearly purposely advertising Austin when they knew he wasn't going to be there, they needed to make that right. So to give us an ending that we didn't see coming, that came completely out of left field, I think was WWE's way of making up for that. And Big Show, of course, would hold the title for like a month before finally coughing it up to Triple H around the beginning of the year or the end of 99. And Triple H would carry it into 2000 to successfully defend at WrestleMania and all that stuff. So I think that initial run of Big Show was transitional because he was just inserted there due to the circumstances surrounding Steve Austin, and the plan was really to go with Hunter going into the year 2000 anyway. And of course, he'd have that great match with Cactus at the Royal Rumble and all that stuff. So Big Show in 99, and perhaps Big Show in 2002. Remember when he beat Brock Lesnar at the Survivor Series? We should watch that one, by the way, on the channel. He won at Survivor Series 2002. I think that was the one where Heyman turned on Brock. And I think really the plan there was to use Big Show as a way to transition the belt from Brock to Kurt Angle so Brock and Angle could work at WrestleMania. So I believe Big Show won at Survivor Series. He would drop the belt the next month, I think at Armageddon, to Kurt Angle, who would then take the belt into WrestleMania to drop it to Brock in the big, that big main event at 19 where Brock almost died. So I think both of Show's, or the first two runs that Show had, were both transitional in my opinion. Also in 2002, guy, we just talked about Brock, so we got to mention The Rock. The Rock's run in 2002, definitely transitional. Austin took his ball and went home and left. The Rock did WWE a solid by coming back early, I think, to work King of the Ring, and then would wind up winning the title, I think, in like the next pay-per-view in a triple threat or whatever it was to set up Rock versus Brock at SummerSlam 2002, which, of course, Brock won in Nassau. Crowd turned on The Rock, and it was really the launching of Brock. And they used Rock, I think, in a lot of the same ways they wanted to use Steve Austin for, to really help launch Brock Lesnar. Of course, Austin wouldn't do it. Rock did it instead. And I think the only reason he really won the title in the summer of 2002 was so he could hand it over to Brock Lesnar at SummerSlam. So you got to put The Rock on that list as well. What about Chris Jericho? In 2001, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of Vengeance right here in San Diego in 2001 when Jericho beat The Rock and Stone Cold in the same night to become the first ever undisputed champion. And as great as that was for his career and how he never shut the fuck up about it ever, at the end of the day, I think he was really just going to be the champion for Triple H to beat when he came back, and Triple H was going to come back as a babyface, so they needed him in there against a heel. I thought there was more story to be told with Austin, because Austin and Triple H were the two-man power trip when Triple H got hurt. They had already teased a little bit of dissension there between the two, and perhaps that Triple H could be the one to go babyface in that, taking on a heel Austin. I felt like at the end of 2001, they were still in position to do that because Austin was a heel all the way up until the end of Survivor Series. So they could have just kept going with that. He could have won at Vengeance and then dropped the belts to Triple H at WrestleMania. And that would have launched Triple H, I think, even more than he was against Chris Jericho. But really, I think the only reason they put the title on Jericho is because they knew when Triple H came back, he was going to win the title at WrestleMania. I think that was the plan all along. So whoever was going to be the champion going into Mania was going to be dropping it to him, which means, one could argue they were a transitional champion. So I think Jericho's 01 and 02 run needs to be on the list. Here's a question for you guys. Randy Orton 2004, yay or nay? Yay or nay? I think maybe, I believe that they purposely wanted to put the belt on him so they could take that youngest WWE champion moniker away from Brock Lesnar, get the belt on Orton while they could. But Orton only held the title for a short time, and then I think Triple H beat him for it. Triple H was the guy that tapped out to Benoit at WrestleMania for Benoit to win the title. So maybe Orton was kind of the middleman there. So I think Orton's kind of debatable. Even though it was a short run and it was a ridiculous run, it still had a run with a purpose. And so maybe it qualifies, maybe it doesn't. You guys let us know below. What about JBL 2005? A lot of people bring this one up, but his run was kind of long. He ended Eddie Guerrero's run after Eddie beat Brock, retained at WrestleMania, then dropped it to JBL, and then JBL would hold it all the way through the next year. I believe he won in the summer of 2004 and dropped it to John Cena at WrestleMania in 2005. So a lot of people feel that JBL was the placeholder, was the champion until John Cena was ready. I agree and don't agree. I think JBL's another one like Randy Orton in 2004 that's kind of on the line. I think I'm leaning more towards him not being a transitional champion more than him being one. So you guys let us know what you think. Also, Rey Mysterio, maybe years later in 2011 when CM Punk came back and cut the pipe bomb. He beat John Cena at Money in the Bank and then left. And then I think they had a tournament and Rey won the title, only to drop the title, which really at the end of the day didn't exist, to John Cena at the end of the show that brought out Cult of Personality for the first time. CM Punk comes out, face off, and then they were set for their SummerSlam champion versus champion match or whatever it was. So maybe Rey Mysterio in 2011 could count. Edge has got a bunch of them. I think Edge probably has at least 3 of his title runs that could potentially be considered transitional, and this is again where I'm going to enlist the help of all of you guys in the comments. Which one of his runs do you consider the most transitional? The ones that I thought of was maybe like in 2007. He won the title at Armageddon only to drop the title to The Undertaker in the main event of WrestleMania 24. Maybe that run could be considered transitional. And maybe in 2008, he won, I think the title was vacant. He beat Undertaker in a TLC match at One Night Stand, and then CM Punk would cash in on him like 1 month later. So I don't think that if they're going to do the Punk cash-in, Punk cashing in on Taker makes a lot of sense. Cashing in on Edge, somebody a little bit more CM Punk size, maybe a little bit less big of a star than The Undertaker, and someone who has won the title that way on himself in cash-in situations. It's karma. It would make better sense for Punk to cash in on him there. So I think maybe 2007 and 2008 Edge, could be categorized as a transitional champion. But you guys might even have better examples for me below. And speaking of CM Punk's in there a couple of times too. I think his 2008 run was a complete joke. That was when he cashed in, like I just mentioned, he cashed in on Edge, but he was kicked out of that Unforgiven match, that scramble match, and replaced, and he never even had a chance to defend the title or drop the title properly. He was just booted out of the match, which means he lost the title by default. I think Jericho won that night. So that 2008 run, could be considered transitional since it was such a fucking joke, and Jericho wound up winning the title later that night anyway. Jeff Hardy and Punk had some title trading going on in 2009. Jeff Hardy won the title at Extreme Rules, and then Punk immediately cashed in on him, and then Jeff won the belt back at Night of Champions, only to lose the belt back to Punk at SummerSlam in 2009 in that TLC match when Jeff Hardy was leaving the WWE. So I think CM Punk and Jeff Hardy both fall into that category, especially Jeff Hardy in 2009 when he was there, to win the title and drop it back to CM Punk on his way out the door. So Jeff Hardy's 2009 run definitely could be considered transitional. We're going to fast forward a bunch of years here and come to something a little bit more current and talk about Bray Wyatt in 2017 when he won the title in the Elimination Chamber, which I believe ended John Cena's title run, and then turned around and dropped it to Randy Orton at WrestleMania just like a month later. So I think it was their way of transitioning the title from Cena to Orton. He was also right in the middle of Goldberg's transitional run in 2020 when The Fiend faced Goldberg in Saudi Arabia. He dropped the Universal title to Goldberg, and of course Goldberg was set to then go into WrestleMania to face Roman Reigns and drop the title to him. Unfortunately, COVID happened, fucked up everything. Roman left, got replaced by Braun Strowman instead, and Goldberg still remained a transitional champion, even though the original plan got messed up. He was still transitional. Either way, he had to drop that belt at WrestleMania to someone, and WWE felt that Strowman was the best option there, and I don't even like to think about that show. Still to this day, I will never, ever, ever go back and watch WrestleMania 36. It's just fucking depressing, man. But yeah, when Goldberg beating The Fiend in Saudi Arabia was infuriating enough, and when you found out that it was all for nothing because Roman didn't even work Mania, it made it even that more disappointing, and it still just bothers the shit out of me that they did that. So anyway, Goldberg in 2020 for sure, and also The Miz in 2021. They used The Miz as a way to get the belt over, I guess, to Bobby Lashley because Miz cashed in, and then he ran face first into Bobby Lashley and dropped the title to him in order for Lashley and Drew to have their WrestleMania feud. So The Miz in 2021, this year, even as recently as this year, we've been seeing some transitional champions. I think he is definitely on the list because, he didn't even really need to be there. He was just used as that middleman between Drew and Lashley. So that's pretty much all I've got for WWE World Champions. If you have anybody to add to this list, please let me know. And in terms of the women, that's where, we're just going to kind of leave that out. I cannot keep track of these women's championships and how frequently they change hands, and to go through and reevaluate all of those title changes and which ones of them were considered transitional would be absolute torture for me to do. So I am not doing it. You guys are going to have to help me out with the transitional champions in the women's division, because I just don't know, and honestly, I don't care. And if I was to go back and watch 15 Alexa Bliss matches, I don't think I could take it. So we are going instead to talk about WCW back in the day. And like I said, I only have a handful of transitional champions or names that I consider to be transitional from WCW days. So kind of here's what we got. And I kind of left out the NWA stuff, and we picked stuff up more in WCW. And I didn't really see a true transitional champion until after Hogan got there. And when you look at WCW and what it became after Hogan's arrival and all the way up until its death in, when Hogan got there in 1994. So in 1995, a match that took place on a pay-per-view that we just did a watch-along for last month, Halloween Havoc 1995, when Hulk Hogan had held the title for, over a year or something at that point? I think 400-something days. He won the title at, I think, Bash at the Beach in 94 and held it for a year and 4 months, all the way into Halloween Havoc 1995, where he faced the Giant. The Giant fell off the roof, came back, wound up winning the title in a very, very shady way, and the title was vacated. And they held the title up to put it on the line at World War III, which Randy Savage would wind up winning. And then Savage and Flair would go on to trade the titles, I think, twice each, going into 1996, before the Giant beat Ric Flair for it in April and held the title until Road Wild. By that point, the NWO had formed, and Hollywood Hogan was able to take the title from the Giant. But I think the 95 run that he had just for basically one night basically counts as a transitional champion, because WCW probably didn't want to have Savage beat Hogan at that time when everything was still very black and white, very good guy, bad guy, babyface, heel. And in order to get the belt to Savage, they were going to have to get it off Hogan first, type of thing. Kind of like how they did it in 1988. I mean, it really does mirror this, because a big giant is in the center of this thing. WCW did that a lot. If you notice, when Hogan first came in, when he worked with Flair, they had Mr. T and everybody at ringside and Muhammad Ali, and it resembled WrestleMania 1. Hogan's first big opponent, I think, was Big Van Vader. They faced in a cage, very reminiscent of WrestleMania 2, Hogan and Bundy in a cage. His big opponent after that was the Giant. Who was Hogan's opponent at WrestleMania 3? Andre the Giant. And then a year later in 88, like we just talked about, when the Giant won the title and they held it up to give it to Savage at WrestleMania, the same thing here. The Giant wins the title. They held it up for Savage to win it. Never really put that together until now, until I just said it out loud. But it is a very, very, very similar situation to what went on in 1988. And Savage had some what was interesting to me when I was making my notes for this is that Savage's title runs, I think he had a total of 4 in WCW. I didn't write down the exact numbers. I'm doing it by memory, but I think his 4 runs lasted a total of 50-something days, less than 2 months in his 4 runs. And I believe he had 2 one-day runs where he dropped the belt the next day or something. So Savage's 4 runs lasted 50 days. Hogan's first run lasted 450 days. So crazy how Hogan just managed to fucking do that. So anyway, Giant in 1995 for sure, transitional champion. Might want to mention Lex Luger as well. Lex Luger started getting over in 1997, and what I do like about this particular run of Luger's is that he beat Hogan on Nitro. And what was so interesting about that match, when he put him in the torture rack and he beat him, and all of the wrestlers came out to celebrate with Luger, that just happened to be in the same arena where SummerSlam 1993 was, the Palace of Auburn Hills, where my beloved Detroit Pistons used to play. They've since torn it down. But we all look back at that SummerSlam 93 match as so odd, because they, were trying to make Luger the born-again Hogan, but then Vince kind of backtracked a little bit, and they had this Lex Express. I mean, all signs were pointing to him driving that red, white, and blue bus into Auburn Hills to win the title and celebrate in front of the audience, and he did win via countout, and he celebrated as if he won the title, but he didn't win the title. They were dropping balloons and all sorts of crazy shit when he didn't even win the title. It was so fucking bizarre. So the fact that this match took place in the same arena where that nonsense went down, I thought was kind of cool. And he won the title in a great Nitro moment, one of the best. Maybe not as good as when Goldberg beat Hogan in 98, but very, very close. But, you know, at the same time, he kind of could potentially be considered transitional, because I think it was only 5 days later, it was at the pay-per-view, Road Wild. Back in those days, I think they used to run Road Wilds on Saturdays, because that's when that ridiculous motorbike convention goes on there. And he dropped the title back to him. So he only had the belt for a few days. Transitional maybe, but certainly an interesting run to say the least. The next year, we got to include Big Sexy Kevin Nash, 1998, ending Goldberg's streak at Starrcade with help from Scott Hall and the cattle prod and the whole deal. That big run of Goldberg's, they have Nash, of all people, who was booking at that time, go over, end the streak, and then just, the next week, January 4th, 1999, finger poke of doom, boom, Hogan pokes Nash, Nash goes down, Hogan pins him, and Kevin Nash was used as a way to transition the title from Goldberg back to Hulk Hogan after, and I believe that was in the same building. Was that the same building that Hogan lost the title in? Was that the Georgia Dome show? Might have been there too. So a lot of tie-ins there, but in the end, Kevin Nash, after breaking the streak, something that should be a huge monumental deal in the history of WCW, turns out to be a joke and a transitional 7-day champion. Fucking crazy that they did that. The next year in 1999, DDP had two different 2-week-long runs in April of May of that year, losing to Sting on Nitro and Kevin Nash at Slamboree. So they finally belted up DDP, which he's earned for so long, only to take it off of him twice within 2 weeks. So it kind of felt like he had some transitional vibes going on there. And the following year, in 2000, I think you can also put Chris Benoit and Sid on this list, because there was all sorts of weird shit that was going on there. Now, Benoit is about to leave for WWE, but prior to this, he's got all sorts of bad heat with management and shit, but they still put him over Sid and have him beat Sid for the title. But the title is vacated after that, because they did a deal where I think they gave themselves an out. Sid, I think he had his foot under the bottom rope when he tapped out or when he was pinned or whatever. So WCW used that as a reason to vacate the title, but in reality, they were vacating the title because their champion went to WWE. So Benoit leaves with the Radicals and goes to WWE. So then they vacate the title, and then Sid winds up beating, I believe, Kevin Nash to fill the vacancy. But then since Nash is the commissioner, he strips Sid and awards the title to himself. So I don't know where the transition falls here, but Benoit or Sid or Nash, or all three of them, are transitional champions or something here. And again, when I was looking through some title histories to get some ideas of dates on these shows, one jaw-dropping stat I came across, which I think I've known, I just haven't thought about in years. Between January of 1998 and January of 2001, a 3-year span, WCW vacated its world title 9 times. Remember Ferris Bueller, the principal? 9 times. 9 fucking times they vacated their world title. Most of it, and only a few times, it was due to circumstances beyond their control. You would like to think you only vacate a title when you have no other option, whether somebody's injured or dead or whatever, not just because you've got some fictitious commissioner that just strips people left and right. I mean, you talk about devaluing championships. WCW devalued their title more than I think any company ever has ever in just a 3-year span. You know, after that belt, that big gold belt, had so much history and tradition, and boy, did they just raped it of all of what was holy, back in the day. So kind of sad when you think about what WCW had done to their world title situation back in these days, but it was a fucking mess, that's for sure. So there you have it. That's basically my list of transitional champions. These are the ones that I deem most significant. I could be missing a couple. There might be a couple that you would consider transitional. These are the ones I just consider to be the most important, that if you're just thinking about wrestling history, these are some names that you also should be able to come up with in your head. If you want to start getting technical, and looking at certain specific criteria for a transitional champion, you can butt me all you want in the comments. You can actually all you want in the comments below. Please let me know what I left out, who I left out, and if any names on my list you wouldn't consider to be a transitional champion, let me know. Thanks again for sitting through another fun podcast. This should be hitting YouTube on Survivor Series 2021 weekend. Probably the Saturday before Survivor Series is when you'll be watching this. So I hope you enjoy the show tomorrow. And if you are around, make sure you hit us up on the channel. We will be reviewing Survivor Series 2021 as soon as it goes off the air. And, we'll be back up here again for a Patreon sponsor review, I'm sure, sooner rather than later. So, Reese Jones, I want to thank you again for your support. I want to thank the rest of you for listening, and I will talk to you real soon, hopefully with another really fun topic. Y'all take care. Peace.